I was gonna wait until I got to this chapter in the BCB review series before talking about it, but the way things are going with that, I'm not gonna get there for another 20 years, so I decided, screw it, I'm gonna talk about it now. I feel like I've been more negative towards the comic recently, and I don't want this channel to just become a comic bashing channel. I think Teshi is a good writer and has written many engaging chapters, including the one we're talking about today, Chapter 79, Critical Hit. So, without further ado, let's jump right in and see why this chapter works so well and why I like it so much. Critical Hit sees the gang going to an art gallery to do research for an essay. It primarily focuses on the dichotomy between Paulo and Sue, though they may not be as different as even they believe. So let's break down both Paulo to see what makes him Paulo and Sue to see what makes her Sue. Paulo is a flirtatious guy. He is immature when it comes to relationships and doesn't understand fully how his actions will affect others. He does genuinely care, but he isn't the best at expressing those emotions. He also feels inadequate deep down over him not doing well academically, but does take pride in his job. He also teases others, though there is no harm meant from him. Sue is an overachiever, and this overachieving sometimes causes her to stumble, like with her play. She also doesn't seem to understand social cues, like when Stacy ignores her at school because of Katie. Even though it is clear that Katie would have no interest in something like Swordsvale, she still tries to talk to her about it. She also feels inadequate, feeling left on the sidelines, and this leads to her desire to overachieve for attention. She does like to try and sympathize with her friends though, even if they might not deserve it. These characters are similar in that they are both immature, just in opposite directions. It's because of this that they make great foils for each other. They don't get along well much of the time, but do still care about each other to a certain extent. Neither sees the complexity in the other, only having a surface level understanding of each other's actions. Sue finds Paulo's flirtatious ways as misogynistic, while Paulo sees her overachieving as annoying in its own right. Critical Hit is a great chapter because it explores some of this misunderstanding, but let's take it from the start. For this chapter, we need to keep in mind the time frame. Lucy has vanished from everyone's life, and all of the characters are on edge because of it. It begins with Paulo and David horsing around some statues, and just before David is going to make his move, Sue pushes him back. It is revealed that they are in an art gallery, and David was attempting to leap over the statues. Sue calls over to Amaya, who is working on a worksheet in front of an art piece. She wants her to join in on her attempt to keep Paulo and David in control. Of course, she doesn't mean for Amaya to literally go to the front desk, but she is trying to rope her into things all the same. Someone comes up behind Paulo and shoves his head for some reason, pushing him into an art piece. Sue takes this opportunity to yell at him, and as he points out, it wasn't his fault. A nearby security guard cautions them about their behavior. This is an interesting point, as it didn't matter who was at fault. From the outside, all of them, that includes Sue, are the problem. And he's right, Sue is yelling and shoving too. Paulo is the one to apologize while they all look sheepishly, but the only one to not look at the guard is Sue. She has the same look as the rest, but looks away. David rubs it in as she was being scolded. Sue doesn't have a good comeback for this, so she just tells him to shut up. Paulo and David take their leave, no longer wanting to be harassed by Sue, and now Sue is forced to get back to work. She does her best to concentrate, but doesn't seem to be able to come up with any answers. Even repeating the question out loud doesn't work. However, Amaya seems to get it, and we almost get her first words when both of them hear a yell from the next room. Sue takes this as a cue to stop whatever she's supposed to be doing to once again go after Paulo and David. Note here that Sue goes alone. Amaya stays behind to keep working. I also like the little touch that Paulo's paper is totally crumpled, showing how little he cares about this project. Paulo and David quickfire the questions, clearly not really caring about doing them well. However, they are getting answers. Sue chastises them about how she can hear them from the other room, but Paulo excitedly tells her that he and David found a new sculpture to write about. He's even so kind as to let Sue look at it. She isn't amused. I also really like the framing of this panel. We don't yet get to see the entire sculpture, but get to look through it and see all of their expressions, with Sue looking unimpressed and Paulo and David looking very happy. We see their sculpture of choice is just a donut. Paulo wants to copy off the explanation on the plaque, but gets concerned that there might not be one. There is, it's just on the other side. David wants to have more fun and recreates the opening shot from James Bond movies. He also does a Porky Pig impression. Sue interjects, asking what themes they are are working on. This really isn't her place to do so. She has her own worksheet to do. Instead of going back to that, she's continuing to monitor Paulo and David. To Paulo's dismay, the plaque has nothing about the meaning of the sculpture, only about what it is made of. Sue goes in on him again, reminding him it's a research paper, insinuating he can't just cheat to complete it. He has to figure it out on his own. Mike walks in with the headset and audio player as he does his worksheet, and Paulo demands to know if it has anything to say about the ring sculpture. Mike chooses not to engage and keeps moving on. This is in stark contrast to Sue, who took every opportunity to drop what she was doing to seek out Paulo and David to chastise them. Paulo attempts to steal the audio player from Mike, and though it is not Sue's conflict, she puts her foot in again, bringing up old drama. Paulo doesn't care and keeps trying to wrench the headset and audio player from Mike. It flies off Mike's head and lands back in the statue from the beginning of the chapter. Mike looks distraught while Paulo nervously walks away, commenting how he can just look it up online. On the next page, Amaya's presence reminds Sue that they should get back to work. Sue anxiously places a hand on her neck as she speaks, but looks back to Paulo and David and reneges on that comment, saying that they have all day, and that she should check to make sure Paulo and David haven't destroyed anything. I like this little background moment of Amaya picking up Mike's clipboard while he is still standing in shock at his headphones, showing that she's still more focused on doing the worksheet and the task at hand than worrying about whatever Paulo and David are up to. Amaya doesn't look too thrilled over Sue's decision, but lets it go. Sue finds the boys and is immediately horrified, and Paulo is starting to look annoyed over her following them everywhere. David sticks a toe out of line, literally, and sets off an alarm. He just wanted to see if it works, and Sue once again belittles him, asking if he's 4. She grumbles about how they share the same grade, but stops when she sees David messing around with another exhibit. Sue steps up to the plate to scold him more about touching things, but Daisy shares that the exhibit is interactive. This leaves Sue very embarrassed. She has now twice put her foot in her mouth because she is trying to be on top of David and Paulo's shenanigans. It doesn't help that David rubs it in again, either. David chooses an option on the laptop and the screen goes black. Daisy wants to write about this art piece, and she says she finds euthanasia to be a fascinating idea. Well, okay then. I also love her expression here. Paulo shows up and wants his turn on the euthanasia couch, but Daisy points out that it ends the same way every time. This is also an important note, as it shows that Daisy has been researching this art piece and knows how it operates. She not only pointed out that it's interactive earlier, but she knows the outcome of each interaction. It seems that David is dead.
If only.
Sue, Paulo, David, and Daisy walk away, with Daisy waving to Abby as she passes. Mike shows up with Amaya. He has retrieved his headset and swiftly dodges Paulo's attempts to grab it again by walking off. Sue is too preoccupied with Paulo to notice and asks to be called by Mike again to get her on track. He flashes some tickets, asking if she's ready to leave the kids behind. She seems to have forgotten all about the tickets, showing how distracted she's been by Paulo and David and how unfocused she is on the actual task at hand. This results in everyone leaving Paulo and David behind. Paulo asks what the deal is, and Mike tells him that Amaya had heard about this paid exhibit, so they all decided to get tickets. Interesting that while they all seem to have coordinated this, they didn't bother to tell Paulo about it. Paulo finds them buying tickets to see more art funny, and calls Mike a loser as he goes upstairs. After a stern look from the gallery attendant, he seems to regret it. Paulo keeps grumbling about them wasting money, not understanding that the exhibit shows something more special than the rest of the art. Paulo tries to gather David up to look at the ring, but David has other plans as it turns out he purchased the ticket too. It's a nice twist and rather comedic too, the way that it's framed. Paulo attempts to follow David, but he's held back by the gallery attendant. Paulo tries to feel superior by teasing them for going up there, but nobody is listening. This is clearly him trying to hide the fact that he feels left out. He overhears Mike and Sue talking about him up there. I'm not entirely sure what she means by "I knew it was a dumb idea," but I'm going out on a limb to say that she's referring to the idea of telling Paulo about the tickets. It is now clear that they told David and that Paulo specifically was singled out by his friends to get left behind. And yeah, that's kind of a shitty thing to do, especially because of how Sue has been acting too. It is especially cruel on Sue's part since one of her big insecurities that we've seen time and time again is being left out. Paulo attempts to sneak upstairs but is stopped once again. Upstairs, his friends are viewing the art pieces and we get a look at a nervous Sue looking at one herself. To one side, Mike is happily jotting down information. The other, Daisy is enthralled by the art, thinking the art is amazing. Sue responds, but isn't so sure. She looks upset and Amaya takes notice. She comes over, which Sue takes as a cue to explain the art that she's looking at. Sue gives us her best examination of the art, calling it lifeless, saying the colors are dull. Amaya doesn't seem to understand what she means by that, but Sue quickly switches gears and decides that they should just all move back downstairs. This is when she runs into Paulo, and it's just one tiny thing that further shows how much Sue was trying to hide her insecurity, that when Paulo and David were acting childish on the flight to Silvershore, she makes a point in not letting them rile her up. Now that Sue has her distraction back, she demands to know what he is doing up there. Paulo just wants to prove a point about how the art upstairs was no different than the rest of the gallery, and comments on the exact piece that Sue had just talked about, saying the same thing she did but with far more conviction. Paulo is going to go back downstairs if the rest of the art is the same as that piece. The obvious parallel is that both Paulo and Sue have the same idea but for very different reasons. The first sign of Sue's real issue with Paulo comes out as she chastises him for not even trying. It surely must burn her that he came to the same conclusion she did, yet did so effortlessly. The thing that ties them together is that while, yes, art is subjective, they are clearly extrapolating the wrong message from the art piece. Paulo throws this back in her face, demanding that she explain what the painting meant. She's caught off guard by his request, but quickly throws it aside by saying that it's irrelevant. Paulo then vents more onto her, throwing back in her face about how nobody likes her, a mirror to him getting intentionally left out earlier. Sue points out that they all came up to the paid exhibit to get away from him, and demands to know why Paulo doesn't just leave her alone. This is laughable, as it has been Sue that has been hounding Paulo the entire trip. Paulo responds the same way she did to David earlier, by telling her to just shut up, though this is justified as Sue has been scolding him all day. Paulo calls her out for pretending to be smart and throws her play in her face. It is interesting that Sue calls Paulo out for believing David instead of addressing his actual opinion about her play. Sue defends herself by saying she tried to do something, while Paulo just hops around from one thing to another and then hits him with the ultimate low blow. She throws Lucy in his face. So this little interaction here shows their misconceptions of each other. Paulo thinks Sue's overachieving is annoying, and Sue believes Paulo doesn't care to apply himself to anything. She also uses Lucy, a girl, to express her distaste of how flirtatious he is. And I guess nobody thought to intervene, and they all just left because we don't see any of them for the rest of the chapter. The next panel shows them about to explode on each other, though I can't tell if they're about to start furiously making out or start throwing hands.
You know which one I want to see.
Paulo, far more damaged by Sue's low blow, breaks off first and even has some tears forming in his eyes. Keep in mind, he genuinely cared about Lucy, and Sue never got to see any of that. On top of that, Lucy was supposed to be something that affected them all, and for her to use that against him as a weapon is in very poor taste. Likewise, Paulo never understood that Sue's play was more about her trying to get Mike and Lucy talking again, though him insulting her on that hits to a lesser degree. But Sue apologizes, and here we possibly get one of the best character moments Teshi has ever written. Sue opens up and tells him that she's having issues understanding the art too, and saying too at the end implies more of a connection between them. It's not just about her, it's about both of them. The fact she actually breaks down this wall is monumental. The entire chapter she's used him as a scapegoat for not having to do the worksheet. This is something she's very insecure about, something she was keeping away from all of her friends, even Amaya, who is her best friend. And she does this for Paulo of all people. Both of these characters have huge egos, especially when it comes to each other, so for her to let that go and express these feelings to him is massive. In my head, I want to believe that it's because she really cares about Paulo a lot and she feels comfortable being honest around him in a way that she doesn't with the others. Of course, you could say that this is because Sue values her other friends' opinions of her more than she values his, but shut up, let me have this one. But more likely, it's because she knew throwing Lucy in his face was distasteful for not just him, but for all of their friends, and wanted to show how sorry she was. This is another reason why I like her so much, because even when she stumbles, she really tries to make up for it. Sue hugs herself and explains that she wants to like the art, and that the difference between them is that she's trying to make an effort. Paulo points out a totally black canvas and asks her to tell him what it means. She gives it a good look over, but isn't able to come up with an explanation. Paulo says he deals with his shortcomings in his own way and doesn't care if it's immature. He perceives this as being better than pretending to know, but not really knowing. His first comment can also reflect how Sue was constantly writing him the whole time about how he was acting in the gallery. Sue's shortcoming is that she always has to know everything, even when she doesn't. And though it's not pointed out by Paulo, this too is immature. Sue walks away but stops for one final message. The way I interpret this is her still putting herself on a pedestal, with her still believing that she's in the right, and is just uneasily shrugging her shoulders at Paulo, calling her out for being a know-it-all. Paulo looks back at the art, visibly bothered as well, and the chapter ends. This chapter is a showcase of what Teshi is capable of given the right circumstances. It's kinda wild how many people regard this era of BCB to be the best, when it also happens to coincide with the time that Lucy is gone. Without having the Mike and Lucy drama to write, she was able to take steps in new directions and write new and interesting things. Critical Hit takes a moment to dissect two characters who are very opposite on the surface, but very similar when you break them down. The fundamental difference is how they choose to go about handling what makes them similar. It also bears the question, is it better to make a joke out of something you cannot understand, or try and pretend that you do understand it? Teshi seems to take a somewhat centrist approach on this, where both philosophies have their pros and cons. Both characters are as equally obnoxious about it, and no one character is in the right. I would go as far as to say that both Paulo and Sue still have a lot they could learn from each other. Though they are foils, they also have something that the other is lacking. Paulo could teach Sue the value of a little bit of humility, and Sue could teach Paulo the value of taking things seriously. Not everything he doesn't understand needs to be made into a joke, and it's for this reason why I can't help but love the two together. They could totally help each other become more well-balanced people, and if they aren't careful, they might just find they are not so different. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.